Welcome to RHI's Sociable City Interviews, where we meet with global thought leaders on nightlife and the social economy. Today, we're here with Greggor Mattson, Associate Professor of Sociology at Oberlin College. Hi, Greggor Mattson. Thank you so much for being here for RHI's Sociable City Interview series. Can you tell us a little bit about your background and your areas of interest and study?
Sure. So I am Associate Professor of Sociology here at Oberlin College in small town, Ohio, outside of Cleveland. And I teach courses on cities and law and sexuality. And those are sort of my areas of expertise. So um, I grew up in Washington State in a small town and spent some time in Berkeley and at Oxford, and then have been here now since 2008.
Wonderful. Thank you. So, in a lot of the cities that we've worked in and we've spoken to, there's been this sense that we're losing our LGBT spaces and anecdotal reports from various cities, but nothing really quantitative to get a sense of the scope of this happening nationwide until I read your publication and started seeing some articles about this. Can you describe what was some of your personal motivation to really dive deep and focus on this as a topic of research?
So I had finished my previous research project, and at that moment, my favorite gay bar in Cleveland closed. And this space was kind of special. I had a really good friend who lived right across the street. So if I would drive into Cleveland to do my grading, he would always meet up with me across the street. It was really a laid back place. And why it was special to me as well was I was new to the area, and this was the bar that was as racially and ethnically mixed as Cleveland itself. Many gay bars are fairly racially segregated, and so this one was very mixed. And I felt like, as an outsider to the region, it was a really good way to have an introduction to this is Cleveland. One evening we were sitting there and the bartender came and gave me this drink that I had not ordered. And I said, "This isn't mine." And he said, "Oh no, those guys at the end of the bar bought it." Usually it's not that often that someone buys me a drink, and it certainly isn't that often that a group of guys buys me a drink. And so me and my friend Eric went down and said, like, "Oh, thanks for the drink. What's going on?" And the friend said, "Oh, our friend, he just got hired at a union job. And he's been trying to get a union job for ages. And so he bought a round of drinks for the whole bar." And like, that is such a Cleveland story. And that this black guy and his two friends bought a white guy and an Asian guy drinks who they didn't know. One time I was there, and in the patio courtyard area, there was this black guy who was doing puppet shows. It's not that often that you see a puppet show in a bar, but there was a puppet show here. And on YouTube, I saw this guy had done other people's birthday parties with this puppet show. So, it was quirky, it was really mixed. And so when it closed, we were starting to see then in about 2015, 2016, this concern that gay bars were closing. But besides just a bar goer, I'm also a social scientist. And so I wanted data, like, are they closing? And if they're closing, what's the rate of closure? Are all bars facing the same pressures? Many of the reports that we would read then were about gentrification closing gay bars. But in cities like Cleveland, gentrification isn't as big a concern as lack of community finance or lack of development. So it seemed like a lot of the discussion was really coastally based. San Francisco, LA, New York. And so I was more interested in a national picture. And so that's where I started this new research project.
And from my understanding, the source material you used was a national guidebook of LGBT venues. And this is something that I had not heard of, and at least in our network, that wasn't very commonly known. So how did you find out about this? And then how could you give us kind of an overview? How was it organized and how did you use it exactly to
Sure.
get your information?
Sure. So my project has two parts. There's this qualitative component where I've driven around the country interviewing gay bar owners and managers in 35 states to try and get a broad picture. But it's also got this quantitative component. And Bob Damron was a traveling salesman in the 60s, and he started an address book. It was called Bob Damron's Address Book. It was conveniently sized so that it would fit in the pocket of your shirt or in the back pocket of your jeans. And it was a listing of it started as a listing of gay bars for gay men, specifically to hook up. So it was an analog 1960s version of Tinder or Yelp. And I had always known about this guide because when I graduated from college, one of the presents I bought myself was the 1997 Damron Guide, which at that point was international, because I thought I'm going to travel and I want to know where the gay bars are where I go. And so I bought that, and that became the foundation of this project. I still have it. And so I bought the 2017 guide, which at that point was the newest one. And with some really crack undergraduate research assistants, we went through the guide and built a database that lists the bars by municipality. The guidebook is really quirky. I mean, it was kind of the first of its kind, certainly for LGBTQ folks. It started out, it was just for gay men, but very quickly by the late 80s, it was listing lesbian bars. And starting in 1990, they started a women's guide. And I was able to interview Gina Gatta, who is the CEO still, and she's been the editor since 1990 or 1992. So it's had this long run. It's been very consistent, and they have a set of codes for the bars that reflect LGBTQ subcultures. So it lists bars for leathermen. It lists bars where people are fooling around on the property. It lists go-go dancers. It lists country and Western bars. It lists bars that are mainly for Black folks or mainly for Latinx folks. So we were able to look at what are the rates of closure for gay bars generally, for bars where men and women socialize together, for bars that are mainly for gay men, bars for people of color. Um, and that became that source. And it's was incredibly complicated because the codes shifted each year or over time. So I had, again, it was a great undergraduate research assistant, Tori Sparks, who came up with how did they change over time? So how could we come up with consistent coding? And that became the basis of that piece that gives the rates of closure over time.
That's fascinating. So were you students literally using just the hard copy manuals? There was nothing digitized at this time. Oh,
At that
wow.
time, no. Now, since then, there's a team who've started digitizing them. And so if you go to mappingthegayguides.com, you can see pictures of these old guides, and they are really good historians who have a sense of what are the ethics of digitizing these old guides. But they got permission from the company, and you can go look at your own city and see what the bars were listed all over the country. But I had to, I bought a lot of these myself on the used book market, and some of them are quite rare. So I used the Gerber Hart Library, which is an archive in the city of Chicago. That was the source for some of them. And then I had a student who went to the New York Public Library and coded them based on that. So it took two archives and a couple $100 to put together a set. Now, we only did it in years that end in 5 and 2. So it's at 5-year intervals. And that, it was coincidental because I had my 1997 guide, and at the time, the newest guide that came out was 2017. But it's also, I've got a co-author at the University of Toronto, Jason Spicer, and it allows us to compare it to the Census Bureau Business Census, which also comes out on years of 2 and 7. So we'll be able to look more closely at how does the regional business climate affect the opening and closing of gay bars.
It sounds like there's still a lot to dig into then, with these
There's a
guys,
lot to
just from these guides.
Absolutely. There's a lot there, and there are other people now who are working with them. I didn't have the resources to go by address, but people who are geographers at the University of Washington they're looking at how did the bars move over time? How do they cluster? People who can use geographic information systems, GIS, are will be able to do more. Mine are just coded by municipality because I was interested in metropolitan regions. I was interested in, do bigger cities retain their bars more than smaller cities? Um, Actually, we haven't completed this analysis, but it looks like cities, cities that are vibrant and are growing have maintained their gay bars. Cities that are struggling or economically divided have lost them faster than other cities.
Oh, that's fascinating. I'm actually wondering because I know you're going to be giving us, longer explanation of more of the findings that you have uncovered during our 2021 Sociable City Summit. But I'm wondering if you could give us a little bit of a teaser of some of the big picture findings that you found out from that study published in 2019, and now that we're in 2021, kind of an update of if you've noticed any changes or new trends.
Sure. So um, one of the figures that kind of took off was the fact that all gay bar listings declined by about 37% between 2007 and 2019. So in that 12-year period, we lost more than a third of gay bars. But um, lesbian bars, we lost more than half of those. We lost almost 60% of bars that were cruisy, mainly for gay men, and bars that were serving people of color declined also by about 60%. So if we lost 1/3 of general gay bars, bars that were serving the most marginalized parts of our community were losing those bars even faster. Um, we are, my undergraduate research assistants and I are making a census of gay bars here in the year 2021. And we're not done with that. But when I went and looked, um, for many states, it looks like we've lost about 15% of gay bars since 2019. And that's better than I expected. I kind of expected a much bigger decline. And given that there was about a 15% decline between 2017 and 2019, it looks like the rate of decline may have been fairly constant despite COVID. And that surprised me. But one of the things we've also found is that, LGBTQ places are very resilient. We have lived through other pandemics. I sort of bristle when people talk about COVID is the first pandemic since the Spanish flu. And it's like, hello, what about AIDS, HIV? We lived through that. There was a decline of gay bars in the 80s during that time, but it rebounded. And LGBTQ bars are really creative. So I know this has been the case for nightlife in general, but uh, some bars took advantage of preferential licensing for restaurants being classified as essential businesses. So bars have added food options. Sometimes it's a bologna sandwich and you got to buy a bologna sandwich and then you can buy a beer. Other places partnered with local food trucks or with neighboring food establishments to offer food to their patrons. Of course, we saw a lot of added outdoor seating. Some cities were allowing parking lots to be converted into outdoor seating or allowing sidewalks to be used in a way that they hadn't been before. I know there's one bar in Connecticut that converted itself into a record store. And so you could see live drag queens, but also buy records and get a coffee at what was now an essential business. And of course, a lot of bars moved their programming online. So the Stud in San Francisco is broadcasting live every Saturday, bringing you the best of the Stud, even though they are one of the places that lost their physical location in the pandemic.
Super interesting, and some of the best examples I've heard of creative pivoting, I have to say, of nightlife venues. And it really seems like there's a lot that other nightlife venues could learn from these different pivoting models. Earlier on, you mentioned gentrification, and I've read a lot of articles about, kind of trying to speculate as to the reasons why we're losing LGBT venues. Can you name maybe the top three misconceptions about, most commonly cited misconceptions as to why we are losing LGBT venues? And I know you're going to go into that in our panel live, but just to put it out there that, that there's more to it than we think.
Well, I would say gay bars are incredibly regional. And in fact, this was something that owners talked to me about. Now, there were bar owners who would own bars in multiple states, but because licensing is so local and it varies state by state, um, it's hard to have something that isn't really tied with the local community. So I would say anytime someone gives you a national generalization, you should be suspicious. Because when I asked owners, like, who are your patrons? Who's keeping you open? Some were like, thank God for my older folks. Like, it's the seniors who are keeping me open. And others would say, like, thank God for the millennials. It's the young folks who are keeping me open. And there didn't seem to be a pattern as to where this was, but this was who was the local community and how well were owners sort of plugged into what was going on there. So my first misconception would be that what's going on in New York City is the same as what's happening in Manhattan, Kansas. Um, the second is gay bars are really related to the local nightlife scenes. So there's been a decline in bars nationally. In part, this reflects changing tastes as consumers increasingly eat food with their liquor. This is probably a healthy thing. So there's been a rise of restaurants with liquor licenses and a rise in bars that have added kitchens and food service. So I think one of the things that's not quite clear to me is, has there been a concurrent rise in gay restaurants? We don't normally think of gay restaurant as being a thing, but anyone who's gone to a gayborhood in Wilton Manors, Florida, or Oklahoma City, these lesser known gay neighborhoods, there's restaurants where the ownership is gay, the patrons are gay, and some of these restaurants have drag shows and the other kinds of LGBTQ cultural forms that we come to expect. So I would say the second is look to the local nightlife scenes and the other bars to understand what's going on with gay bars. And the third misconception would be, often people picture gay bars in the presence of other gay bars. And I think the stereotypical image of them that we get from TV or movies is that it's a gay bar surrounded by others. And the most frequent instantiation of gay bars is the lone gay bar by itself in a small city. So my best sort of pop culture reference would be the bar in Glee. That's Lima, Ohio. Lima, Ohio has one gay bar, and that's actually the most common representation of gay bars is in ones and twos and threes. And so instead of thinking just about gay neighborhoods, we've got to think also about the LGBTQ plus business owners who are in our Clevelands and our Muncies and our Denton, Texases. So those are what I say would be the three things.
You've really debunked a lot of the misconceptions that people have, and I know this may be a question that you may be a little tired of answering, but I think it's still pretty valid to, to ask, do we still need dedicated LGBT spaces? Or because of the advent, it's another one of those, potential misconceptions because of Tinder, because of ways to connect virtually and meet in mainstream spaces and, mainstreaming of LGBT culture. Do we still need these dedicated spaces for socializing amongst this community?
Well, maybe the fourth misconception would be that the LGBTQ plus community is one thing. Like, I always ask, who is the we? Because plenty of my white, middle class, middle-aged gay friends say we don't go to gay bars very much anymore. We go to the restaurant that we like, and we have the privilege to do so. What's interesting is gay bars weren't always as welcoming to women or trans and gender non-binary folks, and that has changed in recent years. And there's something tragic about gay bars becoming inclusive to people just at the moment that they are also being abandoned by more well-off LGBTQ plus folks. So I think for many of us, finding community, being in a space where you're surrounded by people like you, that can't be replaced by an online experience. And I don't want to knock the internet because I can't imagine what it's like to be a 14-year-old queer kid and be able to pull up on your phone any number of content on Instagram or Twitter and be validated in that way. And that's wonderful. But what you don't have as much, especially on the dating apps, is the ability for three or more people to talk to each other. And some of the more memorable nights I've had at bars, we're talking to strangers, and those kind of interactions with people who are much older than you or people who grew up in a different state of life than you, that kind of conversation with stranger doesn't always happen as much, nor does your friend group meet another friend group when you're doing online activities, because the online is really person to person. It's not community to community. And that's where these physical spaces really still have a place for us. Um, and it really comes down to the business owners who are willing to offer that space, to take those business risks, to offer them to us, and to stay plugged in with the community so that they continue to serve all of the LGBTQ plus community and be there for us. So that's what I really respect.
I don't think I've heard such a beautiful encapsulation of the need for these physical spaces versus what's provided on the internet before. So thank you.
Yeah,
Do
you're
you have
welcome.
any final thoughts that or comments that you'd like to share?
The only last thing I guess I'd share is, one of the things I've been most interested to learn is that it's been really difficult for gay bars to receive access to the relief funds that the government has put out. Some of that is because even though gay bars famously offer a lot of entertainment in the form of drag kings and stand-up comedy, because they didn't often charge or issue tickets. They might have charged at the door, but they didn't issue tickets. They weren't eligible for one tranche of funding that the federal government released. Um, Many of our most memorable uh, nightlife personalities are not employees, they're contractors. So drag queens and DJs and go-go dancers and door people were often not eligible for PPP funding because nightlife doesn't always operate on an employee basis. So it's been, I worry for gay bars in their ability to get funding, especially in places where um, people often think of gay bars in a blue bubble, but there's lots of gay bars in red counties, and often they are really well integrated with their red counties. But I wonder whether the designation nightlife businesses that do adult things of an adult nature are specifically prohibited. And I worry that that could mean that a gay bar is being prohibited from having access to the funds. So those are the kinds of things I'm paying attention to right now.
Really appreciate that awareness raising. We know that there have been a lot of issues with accessing relief funds, but I didn't know that specific angle for LGBT venues.
Yes.
So, really appreciate that and hope that the right people hear this. So, thank you so much, Gregor. Thank you for spending the time with me today for this interview. Really appreciate it.
No, thanks so much for having me.